All right, let's turn our attention to the other big story then this week. The Democratic Alliance saying the postponement of the national budget speech is a victory, in fact, for the people of South Africa, as it's halted a proposed 2 percentage point VAT increase that could have severely impacted the economy. The party says as a result, this delay is a result of its strong opposition to the ANC's plan to raise VAT during a time when millions of South Africans are already struggling with the cost of living. But what are the implications of the party withdrawing its support? Let's explore this and several other issues in the wake of yesterday's dramatic turn of events, bringing the CEO of the South African Institute of Taxation, that's Professor Keith Engel, who joins us now via our video link. Prof, lovely to see you. Thanks very much indeed for making time to speak to us. This moment has really also given us an opportunity to reflect on the process. In the past, because the ANC had a comfortable majority in Parliament, it was always presumed that what the minister says is what goes. What we're learning now, of course, is that because we have a multi-party government, this isn't necessarily so.
No, this is a big turn of events. Look, remember, I used to be in the Treasury. So, the minister would stand up and you knew the minister would get whatever he wanted. And there were actually rules in place. And there are rules in place that the minister didn't have to wait to get a rate change made. So he could stand up, make the rate change, and knew the Parliament was going to ratify later on. This is the first time they weren't going to necessarily have that. And I think there was suddenly a change in view. I think this is the first time the minister had to face the possibility that what was proposed was not going to happen. And perhaps people weren't ready for that. I think actually the DA had been quite quiet for a while, so they felt that the DA would go along with whatever they would push. So yes, there is a new game in town.
Sure. And I suppose then with that in mind, I wonder where you stand on the spectrum. And on the one hand, there are people who are saying yesterday's last-minute delay are signs of a government in chaos, while on the other side of the spectrum, there's suggestions that this is actually democracy at work.
Look, I think it is democracy at work. I will say that, to give credit for all the parties involved, had it been months ago and the ANC had lost the majority, a different government would have just faked the election. So what you do see in South Africa is you have a genuine democracy. And in a genuine democracy, there are disagreements. Then the fact that the minister's budget needs to be rediscussed, well, you take a look around the world, these things happen. We're not in a situation like in the US where we're facing a debt ceiling and all of a sudden the government is stopping. It's, this is a budget for a year ahead, and there's going to be a debate. Now, I think there's some people who are always afraid of uncertainty. Well, the question is, what do you want? So if you want a budget where this is the budget you believe in, well, then that's that. But no, I don't really think, I think this shows the strength of democracy that says that people have rights and they have a different say. And given, what's being said about South Africa by a certain partner, we're showing that we are a genuine democracy and that we shouldn't be criticized for it.
It's been fascinating tracking the debate around whether or not this 2 percentage point increase in VAT would essentially work. I mean, government in the main is arguing that they need to make up for revenue shortfall. But those who are opposed to that are saying you cannot tax people in a context where there's stagnant economic growth. In other words, it simply won't work. I imagine you watch these debates very closely. What are some of the issues that have stood out for you as we make sense of this central piece of contestation?
Look, the 2% issue really comes down to a bigger political decision. The ANC has a certain vision. If you like that vision, what they are saying is we have a government, we believe that government should grow. So if you take a look at all these number of years, they're not shrinking the size of government, they're growing it. And they're growing it beyond the growth of GDP. But they believe the answer is big government. And if you do believe in that, the only way to have an effective tax is the value-added tax. That is the one that's the most efficient economically. And if you look at what the minister said, and you look at all those documents that have been redacted, the minister said, this was my least worst alternative if I'm going to keep going on the trajectory that I'm told to go on. The issue really for the DA, and you can now hear it, and for others, is saying we don't want a bigger government. It's not about the 2% VAT. It's about that the taxpayer, the middle taxpayer and the lower income taxpayer can't afford any more. Whatever the government has, they've taken enough, and we don't want a bigger government. So it's about whether we reduce expenditure instead of raising tax. But if you're going to have a tax increase, I think the experts say the VAT is the best way to do it. The question is, must we have a tax increase? Well, we certainly have to do something because we have debt that's out of control and we need to change course somehow. But we're really having a bigger debate than just about a 2% VAT increase. It's which way this government's going to go.
Right, and we'll speak in just a moment about what changing course perhaps may look like if tax isn't the answer. But I've also heard, a lot of talk around what's called an inflection point. In other words, you can only tax people so much until a point where, in fact, it doesn't make a difference. It just makes everybody's life a bit more difficult.
Yeah. Well, you see, there are two kinds, and I think this is what the Treasury was saying. You can't raise personal income taxes anymore. There were a number of taxes that were tapped out. So raising the top rate from 45 to 48, you're not going to get enough. Putting people under more pressure when it comes to income tax and bringing their brackets, there's only so much they can do. So there really wasn't much more they could get out of the traditional means. Now, out of the traditional means, there is an argument that SARS can do more for you. But even though SARS can do more for you, it's going to take time. And the problem is the government needed the money now. So the only fast way to get the money, and this, when it came to the VAT, they could have raised it. They probably could raise have an effect because that'll be less consumption. So, but the 2% they could have gotten, the question is, should government be bigger? But yes, if they were going to get more money, they weren't quite at that inflection point. But what it turns out now was that they're at the political inflection point. And the political inflection point is they can't necessarily move forward because now they don't have the partners they need. But it's not an economic one. It's really a political one, which way we go.
That's interesting. So are you saying we could have, in fact, gotten away with this 2 percentage point in the VAT if there wasn't this political backlog? And my question really is about whether or not it would make economic sense for the challenges that the country is facing.
Well, you see, that's the issue. You could have raised the tax and got the extra money. Whether it makes sense is a bigger debate. So that's what the real argument is about. Yes, you can raise 2%, you'll get more money out of it, but at what price? The bottom line is people will be squeezed more. Maybe your GDP will be slowed a little bit, but you'll get the money. But the question is, should you be getting the money? Do we want to keep going on this trajectory? And if you take a look at this VAT increase, it doesn't cover NHI, which is still out there. So you're really having in the background a political debate. Do you want more taxes and more government? Yes, you can raise taxes. And the question is, are you happy to get more government? Or are you saying enough? We don't want any more taxes because we don't want more government. But it would have worked to get more taxes. The question is that the direction people want to go?
Sure. So government still needs the money. The central question, I suppose, we can all agree hasn't been answered. Yeah. Can't get it through taxes. There's a lot of skepticism around getting it through borrowing, given our debt to GDP ratio. And so the question then is what do you do? And ever since I've been watching the budget, there's always been talk of structural reforms. I still don't really know what that means. But more importantly, I don't know if that'll give an urgent enough solution, given the fact that the money is needed now.
Well, look, I think the question is, that is the point. To be honest with you, if you're going to have a better budget, you're going to have a mix of tax increases as well as cuts. But what you want is cuts that are going to be, with precision and not blunt instruments. So cuts are, where is the government really not efficient? Where is the label is great, but things are not really working? The fear is when people make cuts, they cut services that are essential. They're not covering the middle management. They're not covering the patronage. They're not covering the bloat. They're not covering the unnecessary stuff. So the argument is you can cut a lot of stuff, and you can cut it fairly quickly. And yes, you might not have to have a VAT increase. For instance, if you want more out of PIT, you simply don't get inflationary adjustment. So there are things you can do. There are certain tax incentives that can be cut, and you have to decide whether they're worth it or not in a different balance. But you've got to go in there and you've got to go with a fine scalpel. You can't go in there with a blunt instrument. And it's finding those out. Clearly in this government, there's a lot of things, and there's a lot of programs that are simply not working. They sound great, but really if they terminated them, nobody would miss them. And the same thing with the number of tax incentives. There are some out there. You can knock them off. There are some adjustments you can make. And I frankly think that's a better budget, because you can't keep asking the taxpayer for more and more without some accountability on the expenditure side. And so the argument would be is you really need a mix. And then ultimately, we've got to make this government more efficient. Even the Treasury, a year ago when they wrote, the money they put into government, you find, is not generating the growth the way it should. They said in their own discussions that money for growth just doesn't work. They're not getting their full bang for the buck. So we're going to continue along this path. And look, and I'm not saying that all government programs are bad. There are government programs that are good. And also some things that are needed, like some of the social welfare. A lot of people may not like it, but to some extent, we have a lot of starving people out there, and there's a need in that.
Right.
But we have to make some hard choices. And that's the problem. The ANC doesn't seem to want to make them.
Is that a veiled call for Doge there, Prof?
I wouldn't say Doge, because I think the Doge is got a sense of meanness, and we're cutting things for the sake of cutting it. I think with carefully scripted, let me call for the Bill Clinton era of the late 1990s. They cut a lot of stuff very quietly and very effectively, and they got where they want without all the screaming. But yes, it can be done without the meanness.
All right. Professor Keith Engel, lovely speaking to you. Thank you so much for giving us your take. Appreciate the time. Professor Engel is the CEO of the South African Institute of Taxation.